Well, Canson, I'm the sheriff in this here studio, and there ain't room for you. Well, why not, Sheriff? You ain't got what it takes to be in this here studio. Well, I think you gonna have to prove that. Well, alright. Get ready to draw. I mean paint. Hello, minders. Welcome back to the Mind of Watercolor. Once upon a time, there was a budding artist whose professor told him that arches was all he'd ever need. It was the best. It was great. Don't do anything else. And for 30 plus years, actually more like 40 now, that's all he used. And by he, I mean me. Then he started a YouTube channel. And he thought, how cool it'd be to get more into plein air. Well, this man, not so young anymore, decided he'd take a look at all the cool watercolor journals that were out there. And hey, maybe some of that cheap paper wasn't so bad. I mean, people were saying it's not so bad. Well, anyway, folks, this is the answer to that question I've been asked 1,000 times. At least 1,000 times. It seems like 1,000 times. Bunches of times. Whole bunches of times. Steve, is there a less expensive paper I can use? Well, there are a couple answers to that question. Number one, yeah, there's cheaper paper out there, and yeah, you can use it. And yeah, if you remember my very first video, I said even then, it's crap. Hello, I'm a beginner, and I paint with crap. It's the only watercolor paper for me. Only the worst will do. But you know, I tried to keep an open mind, and I know that some of you have trouble, especially some areas overseas where you have limited availability of the various watercolor brands. So I know that's a problem. And over the years, I've been an evangelist for 100% cotton paper, particularly arches. And the main reason is because, especially for beginners, non-cotton paper is difficult to learn on. Today, I'm going to try to do the most unbiased test that I can. It's not practical for me to test every cheap grade of paper because there are a ton of them, but I've picked three that I commonly see a lot, and so we're going to test those against arches, and not even the best arches. Just the tear-off pad arches, which is what I use as my practice paper. And I will say there are tons and tons of you out there who do take this to heart, who do use 100% cotton paper, and you do it heartily, and you have totally backed me up on this. You know, I've used the example from the Splash Annuals. About 95% of it in there is arches. The rest is usually pretty much 100% cotton. There's usually one fraction of 1% that use something different that may not be cotton. At the very least, just give you the information you need to make a choice. If it's going to make a difference in how you paint, how you practice, and the results you get. Well, so you seem to be pretty quiet. What are your opinions on this paper thing? Only the best for you? Sure, that makes sense, since all the paper comes off of my shelf anyway. Alright, so in this comparison, I'm going to use these three less expensive papers. Now, the reason I chose these three is because these three are the kind I see all the time. They're easily available usually, they're popular, and what we're going to do is a series of tests. And I'm actually hoping that one of these three cheaper papers will rise above the others, because I get asked all the time to recommend a less expensive paper. Most of the time I just can't do it. I've never painted on one that I thought was satisfactory. But maybe out of this will come at least one that sort of outshines the others, if you will. But what we're going to do is look at these as best we can. It's sort of hard to simulate in a test, but I'm going to try to do that and show what the characteristics are and what advantages, if any, to regular cotton paper. Now, this is my control paper, and by the way, this is not the best arches out there. This is the tear-off pad, and the reason I'm using this is what I consider my cheap paper. This is the tear-off pad that I usually get on sale for 40 to 50% off, because Hobby Lobby puts it on sale all the time, or I can use my app. So I pay about $12 for a pad of this. As long as I can do that, I would never buy these. So we'll see what we can learn. Now, color wise, I've mixed up three colors, and I've tried to get them in a fairly watery, they're not super concentrated, but fairly equal consistency. I've got quinacridone red here, I've got Prussian Blue, and I've got ultramarine blue. And we're going to start with Fabriano Studio. These are all 140 pound with the exception of this. This is 90 pound. Now for the tests I'm going to do, the weight won't matter. You know, you would get more buckling with this 90 pound than these, but I am solely going to be focusing on the handling of the color and the washes. So we'll start with Fabriano Studio. A lot of you are going to ask, so I might as well just tell you up front. This is nothing but shelf, sort of a rubbery, grippy shelf liner. I'm shooting this at slight angle. My stuff is constantly sliding down at this angle, so that's the only reason that's there. Sorry if the pattern is a little bit visually annoying. Now the first test is just a flat wash, and for that I'm going to use red. But what I'm trying to achieve with a flat wash is just the most even flat wash that I can get. So all of these tests are intended to simulate control, predictability and control. When I sit down to watercolor, I want to know what my paint's going to do and how it's going to react, and that it's going to do what I hope it's going to do, you know. And generally when I do a flat wash, and again this is not super concentrated, so this is going to come out pink. It's actually quinacridone red. But when I do a flat wash, when I'm trying to get the most even flat wash I can, usually look at it and try to get an even wet sheen by holding it at angles to the light, you know, and turning it. And while that dries, I'll do the same thing with Canson XL. I'll let it dry flat. Each of these I'm going to let dry flat. They all have slightly different textures, so I know there's some preference involved in that. This Canson XL is super popular for low-grade paper. Probably the only one more popular is going to be the other one that I show, and that's the Strathmore 400. I don't know that it's more popular as much as it's just the most available. I can tell right away in application the paint sits more on top of this. I'm not getting a wetting, an even wetting in the wet stage. Now it may spread out and dry more even, but I'm really having to kind of move it around to make it even, and it's not soaking in as much. So I'm seeing that in the handling aspect. I'm seeing that on this. It does seem to be evening out, flattening out a little on its own. And you can see colors are about the same. Now for the famous, or infamous, depending on your opinion, Strathmore 400. I've actually done a lot of painting on Strathmore 400. You can paint, and this is going to be true as we talk about cheaper papers or wood pulp papers. Some people actually prefer them for their style of painting. I will be very frank with you though, not many. Not many. I constantly go back to my splash example. Now this wet nicely and evenly compared to the other two, you know, as I was applying it. I'm not referring to a drying. And then finally my control arches. In terms of application, what you'll notice right away, and these are all cold press, by the way, there's no hot press, is when I dab, I immediately get a spread, an even spread, whereas it beads up more on the cheaper papers. I'm trying to be as objective as possible, but it's noticeable. And I mean, that just went down as smoothly as could be imagined. Alright, let's take a look at the results, and they're all mostly dry now. They're all fairly even. Fabriano Studio brings up the rear. It's pinker, which means it's less intense. More color is soaking in or something, I don't know, but the drying shift was considerable. And you've got a splotchier, streakier wash. This one's similar, but a little more even. This one's pretty even, not bad at all. This one is the most even and also the most intense. Of all the colors, this is the brightest. Now I'm going to do a wash which is not intended to be graded or anything, but it's just variegated. So it's meant to simulate if you're painting along and you're just dabbing in color, because not everybody paints in perfectly flat washes. In fact, most of the time you're not. You're painting either gradations or you're dabbing in different colors. I'm going to take the Prussian Blue and we're going to one by one do sort of an amorphous shape. Still fairly flat. In other words, I'm not trying to grade it, and I'm not going to be real fussy about how even it is. I'm going to let paper decide how much it evens out the wash. I am using a little more water though this time. I mean, I haven't added any water to the mix. They're still those same preset mixes, but I've got a little more water in my brush, and so I'm leaving a little more on the paper. I'm going to do the same thing with Canson XL. Fairly flat, but leaving a lot of water on the paper. Strathmore 400, same thing. And finally, Arches. Right away, I mean, you can always tell when you have cotton paper, because right away it soaks it right up. Less water sits on the top. The other three were pretty much the same in how much water was sitting on top. This just kind of takes the water right away and spreads it around. It's really hard to tell a lot of difference here. Now I will mention that Prussian Blue, especially M. Graham's Prussian Blue, is a heavy granulating color. Beautiful granulating color. And the granulation in all of these is nice. Even though this is all cold pressed paper, they are different textures. The Arches is probably the roughest. So colors granulate more on smoother paper because the texture usually distributes the granulation more. So when you have a smoother paper, you're going to see it, and you indeed do. You see more granulation in these three. That's really a stylistic thing. That has nothing to do with quality of paper. And all appear to have distributed the paint fairly evenly, except for Arches. It distributed a little more even. I have a very even color here compared to these three, so that's notable. Although all four are acceptable, but I have a noticeably more even color, and once again, as with the red, this color is more vibrant, a little more intense than the other three. So let's do a graded wash next. Now for these, I simply used a template so I could draw a square that was exactly the same size. And once again, we're going to start with the Fabriano Studio. And this time I'm going to use ultramarine blue. This will be like doing a blend, a small blend. So I'm going to blend from full strength on this edge out to almost nothing on this end. And all I'm trying to do is get an even gradation from one side to the other. Fabriano Studio. Canson XL is next. Strathmore 400. Last but not least, Arches. Once again, I mean, I have to say it, I'm always amazed whenever I start painting on Arches how it just grabs the paint and distributes it for you. It's the most amazing thing about cotton paper, I think. While you're applying it, you just notice a difference in that aspect alone. Forget about what it looks like after it's dry. Alright, let's take a look at what we've got. Both the Strathmore 400 and the Arches gave me fairly even gradations. And in every case, I kind of went back and dabbed. Didn't do it so much here. Dabbed a little more blue at the beginning just to give myself a little more intensity at the front. But so this one's a little less intense. Both of these did not handle the reintroduction of more paint very well. I've got backruns, small backruns in each case. And that's a typical problem with wood pulp paper, is you get uneven drying. You get quickly drying in one area, the other area is already starting to dry, and you get unevenness in the wash. Less so with the Strathmore 400, so that's interesting. Very even here. Some of this is going to vary based on my brush strokes, but as I look, I'm happiest with these two washes. This one is by far the most intense. That one is, but I would not accept that wash for what I was trying to achieve, and that is a nice natural clean gradation. Another thing to note, and due to the pencil outline it may be hard to see, both these two, not so much this one, both these two have pushed pigment to the edge, and now you have a harder, darker edge. That is something I know from experience that you will get with wood pulp paper much more often. It just doesn't exist here. It may be just microscopically darker on the edge, but it's much more even. The wetter the wash on wood pulp paper, the more likely you are to get pigment pushed to the edge and a hard, almost outlined looking edge. It didn't show up in this color or in these, so that's good. It usually shows up when you're using more water, which I ended up doing because as I graded out the paint I added more water, and as a result I got hard outlines on these two. What I'm going to do next is I'm going to paint and shade a circle, and I'm going to use two colors for this and probably do some layering. So I'm going to draw a small circle on all of these so I have about the same shape to work with. So this will be the first test of actually painting something. This I will paint as a sphere and shade it like a sphere. And what I'm going to do is use the quinacridone red. This paint may be starting to get more intense, mainly because the water is evaporating out of my pan. And when I'm painting, creating a shaded object, I use a variety of methods, and I'm going to try to use that variety here. So I've got, I'm filling it in first with a flat shape, but what I'm going to do is blot my brush. I'm going to lift out a highlight. This is a typical thing I would do, typical way I would paint. I'd get a little more pigment and water down here. I'm going to leave that lighter on the edge as if it were a reflected highlight. But while it's still wet, I'm going to charge into this shadow a little bit, a little wet and wet charging. It's already doing unexpected things. I didn't want it to pick that paint back up. We'll call that the first layer. Let's do Canson XL. You know, as I was saying before, so much depends on how you paint. Wood pulp paper works okay, maybe satisfactorily for one application style of painting, for a minimal of layering. If you do a lot of wet and wet, carefully modeled shading, it's less suitable for that. Alright, and let's go to the Strathmore 400. Alright, got it filled with red. Same thing. Looked out my highlight up here. I'm trying to use the same amounts of paint, but it's hard. And ultimately what we're testing here is the paper's ability to take the paint that I'm putting down with various amounts of wetness throughout the circle and blend it all and see if the paper has any bearing on how it blends those colors and wetnesses. Finally, last but not least, arches. Definitely thirstier than the other three papers. I have to reload my brush, rinse my brush, blot it out, pick up a highlight, a little more pigment down here, and I don't want to fiddle with that a whole lot. We'll let that dry. Alright, so let's look at what we've got. And this is where the results start to get a little more dramatic. On these three, on the wood pulp cheaper papers, notice that in different ways, the paper was not able to handle the variation in wetness. This is just a splotchy sort of mess, and there's been no blending here. it sort of created a bit of a black background, and I realized there are differences maybe due to human error in the way I approached putting down the paint. Here on the Strathmore, it just created sort of a purple background, and all of these are sort of posterized. By posterized, that means the colors just sort of separate and go into their own pools. But notice on the arches how the paper just sort of blends for you, and one of the reasons for that is because of the overall evenness that we've been seeing in the way the wash spreads. It handles differences, great differences in wetness. This was so much wetter down here than that up there, and yet the whole thing dried fairly evenly. Now, I would probably, in a real rendering situation, I would want to go back and make the shadow darker with a glaze. Now, realistically, I'm out of luck with these. I would have to do a lot of fixing before I even could use it. Like, you know, maybe see if I can blend this edge, and you know, then I'm starting to do some painting just because my wash didn't come out so good. So already I'm in overwork territory, and I can even it out some. Still splotchy and uneven, and you know, your painting style may be such that that's okay. And for quick studies, maybe some of this is fine for you. Now here, I'm not sure what to do with that because it just left me with one big purple background. So rather than try to, let's see, maybe I can blend the edges of this so there's not so much of an edge. But the spear on the arches paper is ready to go. So I'm going to get some red. I'm going to add a glaze and deepen this shadow. This time I'm not working wet into wet. I'm adding this color here, and then I'm going to blot my brush and just blend out the edge. So now I've got a red glaze over that. Let's just go ahead and try to do it with this. It's not going to be right. I mean, that for me, that wash for a sphere is not acceptable. And already I can see it's loosening up the underneath paint, so I'm not going to end up with a clean glaze. I'm going to end up with a loosened up underneath wash. Trying to combat that, I'm not going to brush it anymore. I'm just going to lay down that one wash and move on. This one, although it's splotchy and streaky, it might still work as a loose, rough representation of a sphere. Let's go ahead and deepen that color there, working wet on dry, and then I'm just blending out these edges to make them soft. Once again, and I'll try to do it on the Fabriano. Once again, the Fabriano, the color is just extremely weak. It just looks like I watered it down a stage further. And what I would do in a normal painting situation probably is I applied this red glaze, and then I would go back and apply another blue glaze, and I might go back and forth like that until I got that shadow as deep as I wanted it. Even before it dries, you can see how even that is. Now I'm just going back with another blue glaze to deepen that shadow. Alright, so after that last blue glaze, you can see I pretty much lost control of these two. This, I mean, in a loose, rough sense, I could probably make it work. These just look like big blue smiles. This, totally fine. I got fairly smooth gradations. You know, if I were working with these, I would start over. That's just unacceptable, at least for me. If I were doing this, you know, in actual, I would add one more red glaze here, like I'm doing now, just to kind of unify that, soften those edges. This right here just is not right. Where I've added the successive glazes, there's too much sizing. It's loosened up the paint underneath and lightened the color, so it's not truly a glaze. In other words, what's happening is these successive wet glazes are just picking up the paint and redistributing it, which is not a glaze at all. It's probably one of the biggest problems with cheaper paper. And if you don't paint in thin glazes or wet glazes, then maybe you don't have a problem, but this is barely acceptable in a loose painting sense. These are totally trashed. Although I didn't take a lot of care with this, this is what I'm looking for and is usable. Now while that's drying, I'm going to do another thing. And I've got a scrubber here. And so what I would probably do as a finishing touch to this is scrub out a really hot highlight here, just to make it look like this spear. Got a really nice shine to it. Come over here and do that with Strathmore. And it's not doing too bad, as long as you're gentle. Don't get carried away, even these cheaper papers. Now see, that's terrible. That's just a few strokes, that's already pilling. And you should always scrub gently. And in other videos I've mentioned, if you do any scrubbing, don't take the word scrubbing seriously. Scrubbing is actually done very, very lightly. I'm not going to do any further with this. Those are lost as far as I'm concerned. The only things that worked were these two flat washes. The gradations didn't work, that didn't work. Another test that I wanted to show you is extreme wetness, and that's where you leave like a huge amount of water on the paper surface. If you're doing skies or really big washy areas, you're going to end up with areas like this where you end up with puddles. What does the paper do with all that water? And we're going to, without stopping up any of that, we're going to set it aside and see. Well, that really ended up a little darker than I expected, so you can't really tell a lot. Although what I am going to do is take some red, put a glaze over that, see what happens, because that's such a concentrated color. But what I'm going to do to end, scoot this up a little, is I'm just going to take all three of these colors and do a giant kind of wet and wet wash, and I'm not even going to use the other two. And this is barely even what I would consider usable anymore. This failed because that last glaze I put over that, as I said, it loosened the paint up that was underneath. It did not create a glaze. Instead, what it did is it loosened the paint beneath and created a mix. What I'm going to do now is use this flat and wet the area extensively with clear water. This may tell us nothing, but I'm just going to do it, see how the two react side by side of all three colors. Boy, that really, it's really lively color. And all I'm doing is just dabbing it in. This actually may produce totally fine results in either paper, because You know, it's such a chaotic process. We're going to take a look anyway. Notice how, even before it dries, how the colors separate and sort of isolate themselves on the Strathmore, but on the arches they blend. So I'm going to lay those flat. Also notice on the Strathmore, before it even dries, how that glaze over the top of that heavy pigment picked it up and moved it really easily. Just ever so slightly it did on the arches, but pretty much you got a clean glaze over the top. And as I mentioned before, I'm not even bringing the other cheaper papers into this anymore. Up until this point, Strathmore was performing the best of the cheap papers, but it fell down significantly here. I mean, essentially glazing is almost impossible because of these two tests. The wet and wet washes look out of control and separated. There's no blending like you have here, but there's just an evenness. What this all amounts to, folks, is control. It just amounts to the paper doing what you need it to do when you paint. You know, nice smooth flat washes, nice smooth gradations with no hard edges, glazes that don't drastically lift the underlying layers as this did and this did. Paint that moves and blends and mingles and just makes beautiful color, more vibrant colors. As you can see the difference in the two. I've just come to a point, and I keep trying it, you know, in sketchbooks and stuff, but even in my sketchbooks now, I'm just trying to move completely to all cotton paper. It's just frustrating not to get the results, not to have the painting turn out the way I want it to turn out, and not to have the paper do what I want it to do. And so for all of the videos I harp on this, I hope you can see why. And I do again stress, depending on your style of painting, this may not be a problem, but no matter how I paint this, I'm always working around the shortcomings of the paper, or working in a style that has to take into account the shortcomings. I never have to do that with arches, or for that matter most other 100% cotton paper, and they do vary, I realize. I hope that was of some use to you. I hope that kind of backs up what I've been ranting on for so many episodes. And I'm so sorry if the cost of cotton paper is an issue. I really am, but I just can't do anything about the results. They speak for themselves. If you want this kind of results, you've got to use this kind of paper. Thanks everyone for watching. Thank you patrons for your support. Thank you for sponsoring this channel, and we will see everybody in the next video.